Hi everybody, I'm Jeff Neithercutt. I want to talk to you today about blockchain of evidence. We're going to talk a little bit about everybody totally familiar with blockchain, or kind of some cryptos, some distributed ledger technology, crypto. Okay, so I'm going to cover some of the basics just because I know they're recording and some of the people who watch it may not be totally familiar, but I'm going to try and flip through that so it's not totally boring. But we're basically going to talk about how to use Hyperledger blockchain technology to collect evidence at a crime scene and then make it immediately transparent to the public from that point all the way through until it gets to court, without exposing the evidence and without exposing the victims or the officers or anybody else involved in the case. So I'm Jeff Neithercutt, former police officer and dispatcher in the San Francisco Bay Area for a little over a decade. I have a master's degree in cybersecurity. I'm a published author, and I'm currently working for the state of California as a senior cybersecurity consultant, helping them rewrite their policies, standards, and procedures, because as I'm sure all of you are aware, the government tends to be about a decade behind the rest of us. And so in this particular area, that's something that desperately needs to happen. So blockchain of evidence is myself and my wife as the primary partners, and then the Chief Information Security Officer from the State of California Department of Justice is on my advisory board. So is Curtis Darnell, who was the Chief of Santa Clara County Communications, responsible for 911, law, fire, and medical aided dispatching. And then Consult Your Community, which is a really cool group out of UC Davis. A bunch of graduate level marketing students came on board and printed out some cool brochures and business cards and stuff, and I've got those over there if anybody wants some paper to take home. All right, so what's the problem? Well, basically, we've all seen it in the news, right? Law enforcement has lost the public trust. I know it from being on the street, being a police officer, being spat on, having people accuse me of things. You know it from watching the news where people do things they shouldn't do and get caught. And I think in general, one of the main reasons why police have lost the public trust is the fact that we have all these problems with a 200-year-old evidence collection process. We're still putting guns in pizza boxes and sealing them with Scotch tape and writing our signature and date on it, and then passing it to the next officer who writes their name and date on it, and then it just passes through and through and through. And it's a completely trust-based system, which probably had its turn in history at one point. But the bottom line is, why aren't we collecting all of the metadata that we could be collecting along with that piece of data? Things like GPS location, case number, badge number, officer name, victim name, suspect name, where it was in the scene itself, what state it was in. Was it wet? Was it dry? Was it bloody? Was it covered in white powder? Why aren't we collecting all that? So the problem has become so big with mishandling of evidence that even our governor noticed. So in March, he put a moratorium on the death penalty in California, quoting a National Academy of Sciences report that estimated that 1 out of every 25 people on death row are actually innocent. 1 out of 25. That's like 35 people who are waiting to die who didn't do it. And that's just one segment of the corrections industry. We see it on the news every night. We hear about these people who are being released after 30 years, 40 years, 20 years, 10 years, whatever. The average prison stay for an innocent person in California is 10 years. 10 years of their life gone because somebody didn't do something the way they were supposed to. So how bad is the problem now? Annie Ducan is sort of my poster child for this. She was a lab technician in Massachusetts who admitted to falsifying evidence affecting up to 34,000 cases. So what Annie was doing was what's called dry labbing. She took a known sample of cocaine, and then she took all of the samples of cocaine being submitted by police officers in allegations of possession of cocaine, and rather than having to individually test each one, which would have slowed her down, she just mixed them and then said, okay, now I know it's got cocaine in it. So that's a big problem, right? All those people had their whatever it was they were carrying mixed with cocaine and then were convicted of possession of cocaine. So 34,000 cases. When they figured her out after 6 years and numerous audits, when they finally figured it out, she admitted to it and said she was gunning for a promotion. The more lab cases you do in that lab, the higher up the chain you go. She got the promotion and then she got some jail time. 34,000 people went to prison. That's pretty unacceptable. So LAPD and a lot of the other police agencies over the last 10 years have started issuing body cameras, saying, you know what, we're gonna put cameras on these officers. We're gonna watch what they're doing because we think the real problem is with the officers. And what they're finding is it's really not. But some of the things that are coming out in the news make it look like it is. For instance, the very first LAPD body camera film released showed an officer putting cocaine into a suspect's wallet rather than taking it out of the suspect's wallet. The news made a huge deal about that, further diminishing the police department's trust. Rightly so, if that was the case, but that's actually not the case. If you play the whole video, what you find is that the officer, who was wearing a new type of technology that he wasn't real familiar with, forgot to turn his camera on when he first started the probation search of the suspect's car. So after he found the cocaine, he looked at his partner and went, uh-oh, I was supposed to have my camera on. Oh, that's okay, I'll turn it on and we'll do it again. Really, really bad decision making. Bottom line was it still came from that suspect. And do you think the district attorney dropped that case? Oh yeah, like a hot potato. And it was a whole situation was bad from the get-go. But adopting new technology, especially for police officers, has been problematic, and this is just one instance in which body cameras make it look like the officer was doing something wrong. They've also caught officers actually doing things wrong, and that's never good for a profession. So how bad is this problem? Well, exoneration is what happens when you get enough money to pay an attorney to redo your entire case from beginning to end. So as you can imagine, those who end up in prison or jail quite frequently don't have that kind of cash. So exoneration trials are actually very rare. But of the exoneration trials that occurred between 1989 and 2017, 57% of them that were successful were due to evidence-related false convictions. And in these two categories, we see the highest number of evidence-related false convictions. Does anybody have any idea why low-grade drugs and murder would be the two categories where we would see the highest number of evidence mishandling?
Because America's the greatest country ever.
That's not a bad idea. I don't know if it's true, but it's not a bad idea. Okay, so in the murder cases, what ends up happening is the district attorney has a case that's been built for years. And they end up in court 18 months, 2 years, 3 years down the road. The district attorney goes and reads the case and realizes, that didn't happen that way. We've got video that shows it happening a different way. Excuse me, officer, would you mind just fixing that for me? That's mishandling of evidence. There's actually a procedure for how to change a police report, and they're supposed to follow it up with a supplemental report that says, on date at time, district attorney so-and-so notified me that I made a mistake in my report, so I corrected it. Here's the supplemental report documenting the fact that I corrected that. So some of this is not necessarily an intentional fact cover-up. Some of it is just, and I don't remember who said this, but somebody said, never attribute maliciousness to something that can more easily be explained by stupidity. This is just stupidity within our process, and it needs to be fixed. So how common is this? Well, for $20.99 a month, you can get this from Adobe After Effects. They'll take any standard video, whether it's body cam footage, dash cam footage, your cell phone footage, what he's filming in the back there, and they'll put things into the video, take things out of the video, make it look completely real. $20 a month. So why would somebody want to do that? Well, there's a lot of different reasons. Depends on the person entirely. In this particular case, an individual who had cancer wanted to make sure that their insurance company didn't deny their renewal, so they removed it. Got renewed and then suddenly had cancer again, and then they got coverage, which I think, more than a few people dealing with a life-changing event might think about doing. But the bottom line is this is becoming so easy that it's not going to be too much longer here before everything you see in the media, everything you see coming out on television, you will have to ask yourself, is it real or not? Because they're so good at this now, it's that hard to tell. So will it happen with body cam videos? Certainly could. We've already seen it. President Obama was overlaid into a commercial. We've seen it with stars' faces being put on other people's bodies saying things that they didn't actually say, and they're called deep fakes. Of course, this is not exactly the same thing when we're talking about law enforcement because it's not somebody doing something politically. But the problem with this remains that a citizen can document a scene, take it back home, and make the scene different, and then present that to the news as if it's what factually happened. So then the police department rolls their body camera footage out and says, no, we've got alternate footage. And then you're faced with two different pieces of footage contesting each other. Which one's legit? How do we know that? Solution. We're going to use blockchain and hashing to create an immutable encrypted digital fingerprint generated immediately upon collection of every piece of evidence and then uploaded to our private but publicly visible, transparent blockchain. And the purpose of this is to allow all parties to track the evidence securely from crime scene to court, because what happens in these instances? Somebody gets shot, somebody gets killed, the family's really, really upset. And for the next 10 days, people are rioting in the streets demanding answers. We want to know what happened. We want to know whether there's a body cam. We want to know whether there's any sort of video involved. And the police department keeps saying, we've got it, we'll show it to you eventually, we'll show it to you eventually. But they don't believe it anymore. We've lost the public trust. So how much easier would it be if the family could log in that very night and see a hash of a body cam footage video that's already been captured? So the department can say, look, we've got the video and here's a hash of it. So if we try to manipulate it or change it in any way, shape, or form, you will always and forever be able to tell. Because that's how hashing works. It's a one-way digital fingerprint. And so for the physical side of things like guns, knives, etc., we have tamper-evident RFID tags that we place on them, photograph it as its actual state with that RFID tag on it, and then if anything changes about the state of that item, it has to be updated. All right, so this is what made me look at it in the first place, besides my wife coming up with a brilliant idea. The definition of the chain of custody is it's pretty simple. It starts at the crime scene, then it goes to the property room, laboratory, investigating division, whatever, a scientist if it needs to be labbed. Ends up back in the property room until it goes to court. Well, that's what blockchain does, only it only goes in one direction, right? You have the genesis block, which starts it off, and then each block after that relies on a piece of the block behind it, so that if you remove any of the blocks, all the rest of them become immediately invalid. That's key to this. That's key. So Wikipedia talks about what blockchain is. You've got a genesis block, you've got your main chain, you've got your orphan blocks where they've been submitted but they haven't been accepted yet. We're going to talk about Hyperledger because Hyperledger works best for this. And we have to have a private, we can't go public and anonymous. We have to have private, we have to identify because each and every individual police officer has to be given a username, password, two-factor authentication, and a device to capture the evidence with that can always and only be assigned to them, just like their firearm. They lose their firearm, it's all sorts of paperwork and crazy amounts of getting in trouble. Same thing would happen with this. This is the only thing they can collect evidence with, and it will always and indelibly lead back to them. So how does a distributed ledger work? For those of you who know, this is sort of going over it, but the way I like to think about it is we all have the same checkbook. So if you write a check to Comcast for $65, we all immediately know it and our balance changes. And if you write a check to Nugget for $65, we all immediately know it and our balance changes. But if somebody goes back 2 weeks and erases the Nugget charge and changes it to AT&T for $15, everybody's ledger is immediately wrong. They're all invalid. And they all know who made the change, because they can see it immediately. That's the key to this. So we already know how blockchain is structured in most cases. What we're going to talk about is a trusted ledger owner or actor by validation. And in our case, we're going to give a copy of this blockchain to every law enforcement agency in the world. Because each one of them is going to identify the individuals within their agency who handle evidence. They're all going to assign them a specific block within the chain and a specific device and a specific username, password, etc. And then every time this piece of evidence gets introduced by that officer, everybody in the world, every other police agency will be able to see it. Now, why would we do that? Why would we want every other agency to be able to see it? So when the family comes in and says, you're trying to cover this up, it's mathematically impossible. We would have to get 51% of all of the police agencies in the nation to change that entry before we could make it valid on the blockchain. Physically impossible, mathematically impossible for the local agency to change that piece of evidence without everybody being able to immediately see it, forever. This is what it looks like on the internet. This is just a sample in time of Bitcoin. This is why we don't want to do the anonymous and open distributed ledger thing where nobody knows who anybody is, because when they have a transaction, they just reject it. They don't make any effort to identify it or do anything with it. We do. We do want to do that. We want to identify who's making this fraudulent transaction, who's trying to change this item on there. And we're going to stop it, and then we're going to start what's necessary to make it right. So in a permission system like this, each one of the users that's on the blockchain that makes a transaction is known. And all of the entities who approve that transaction know who made it, when, why, where, and how. And they all have to approve it. And they can all see if it's rejected at some point later or tried to be removed. So as I said before, it cannot be altered retroactively without alteration of all subsequent blocks, and each block contains a piece of the block before it. Hashing, for those of you who know what it is, this is going to make perfect sense. For those of you who don't, you're throwing math at an item, and what bounces back is a number that will always be the same. Every time you throw it at that item, as long as it hasn't changed, you'll always get the same thing back. But if you change even one letter, you get a completely different number. completely and very obviously different number. So you know right away if even one little pixel, one little bit in that file has changed. So this is how we picture it working. The police departments all have copies of it. Prosecutor all has a copy of it. You can all log in and look at it. The court has copies of it, and the defense attorneys all have copies of it. So what happens when the defense and the prosecution get together and they all have the same evidence, and it's already been verified mathematically? What happens to our case backlog when the evidence is stipulated to by both the prosecution and the defense before we even go to trial? Yeah, that's a good thing. All right, so the public can log in and see the hashes. They can see that something labeled body cam video with a hash on it is there. They can log in and see that, a gun with a hash on it is there. That's all they can do is view the items so that they know that their case is being, first of all, handled. Second of all, the evidence was collected. And third of all, there wasn't anything left behind. Maybe they saw something and they don't see it in that list. They're on the phone to the cops before too much time has passed saying, hey, wait a minute, you missed the license plate that was sitting right in front of the car that hit whoever. Prosecutors can see whether or not they want to do the case right away. They don't have to wait for the report to come in. They don't have to wait for anything to see if there's anomalies with the evidence. If the blood was taken in a DUI case at 2:01 a.m. and it was processed at 4:01 a.m., that's a good chain of custody. It hasn't even cooled off yet. But if it was processed 3 weeks later in an out-of-state lab and there's no nexus between where it was taken and where it ended up, there's a whole lot of doubt to be cast there. District attorney might want to save all of our money and not prosecute that case if the evidence wasn't handled in a way that establishes integrity. And eventually, so many trusted users will be on the system that changes won't be possible, so we have to start somewhere, right? We've got to build it up. Just like with Bitcoin, you've got to start out with a bunch of users and get it going bigger and bigger and bigger. But will the courts accept it? Who thinks the courts will accept it? Who thinks the courts won't accept it? They already have. There's an exception to the hearsay rule that says a blockchain record is admissible over hearsay objections when it's accompanied by a written declaration of a qualified person testifying to the details of the transaction. What does that describe? A police officer writing their own police report, sitting on the stand and saying, I picked up that piece of evidence, I took the picture of it, I hashed it, those are all the entries in my evidence log. It's already acceptable in courts of law. All right, so let's check out a real-world example. Everybody remember the romaine lettuce scare? People were dying of this stuff, right? E. coli, and all they could tell us was, don't eat romaine lettuce from, over there somewhere. Because this label doesn't contain any information other than a PLU and romaine. So, after the first food poisoning cases came in New Jersey, they figured out eventually, the FDA came in and started tracking what they call one-up, one-back tracking. They figured out that the tainted lettuce was coming from the Yuma, Arizona area. But how do you warn people, don't eat lettuce from Yuma, Arizona, when it doesn't say from Yuma, Arizona on it? The people are assuming that the stores know where it's coming from, but they don't. So they're not pulling it off the shelves because they don't want to have to pay for the rotten spoilage. There's dozens of supply lines crossing 32 states. And they use one-up, one-back tracking. So the farm knows which processor they sold it to, and they know who picked it. But as soon as it gets to the processor, you lose the picker. So then when it goes to the distributor, you lose the farm. And when it gets to the retailer, you lose the processor, the farm, and the picker. So you have to keep going back. A lot of this stuff is being handled on paper sometimes. No one knows more than one level of delivery. There's dozens of supply lines crossing 32 states. And at each instance of this, you have a problem with potential social impact, legal culpability, and economic loss. Walmart fixed it. Why would Walmart fix this? Well, they were getting sued like a lot of people that were carrying romaine lettuce. So IBM walks up to them and says, hey, we got this blockchain thing, and we think this would be really good for tracking lettuce, so you guys want to give it a whirl? And they're like, well, how much is this going to cost? And they're like, well, you're the first one, so we'll get it started with you. But let's just take a month and get all your distributors and everybody on board. So the food safety expert at Walmart says, well, first of all, we got to be able to track whether this is going to work or not. So he grabs a packet of sliced mangoes off the shelf, throws it to his food safety crew, and says, track this, go. Clicks his stopwatch. So they're doing the one-up, one-back tracking. Takes them 6 days, 18 hours and like 2 minutes. They install blockchain throughout the system, all the way from end to end. And in front of their stockholders, they did the same mango supply line in 2.2 seconds. No surprise to those of us who understand the technology. I mean, hey, if you actually write this stuff down, it's really not that hard to follow where it came from, where it went after that, and where it moved on. But they weren't tracking that information, just like law enforcement is not tracking that information. So in this case, they were tracking the farm origin data, batch numbers, factory and processing data, expiration date, storage, temperature, shipping details. A lot of that stuff is important to law enforcement as well. If you're taking a biological sample from somebody that needs to be submitted to a lab, you have to be able to verify that the temperature doesn't rise above a certain level, or you've got a problem with contamination of that biological sample. There's not really expiration dates on evidence, although in some cases there's, think after 3 years you can't process misdemeanors or felonies, and after 1 year misdemeanors. But in general, what they were doing was specific to them. What we're going to do is specific to law enforcement. So the officer is going to arrive at the scene, hopefully catch the bad guy or girl. They're going to start collecting evidence. So for the physical items like the baseball bats and suitcases and nunchucks of the world, we're going to put the tamper-evident RFID tag on it, and we're going to take a photo of it using an app that actually hashes the photo the minute it's taken. So right at the time they take that image, it's hashed. They know the state it was in, where it was, GPS location, badge number, case number, etc. And the item is now collected and stored in evidence the way it normally would be. Evidence goes to the police department, hash goes to the public website, so we can all look at it if we want to, because transparency, right? Anything they take digitally, like body cameras or audio, it gets hashed within the device as well. The hashes go to our blockchain. The evidence goes into the secure evidence locker. Whatever needs to be gets digitized, it all gets hashed, it all gets uploaded to the blockchain, and then throughout the case they can check it and verify that it hasn't been tampered with, hasn't been lost, hasn't been stolen, whatever. So what keeps the collector from using someone else's username and password? Well, we're all familiar with these, right? Two-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication. These things are dirt cheap now. You can buy a 5-pack for $1 on Amazon. I don't know how good they are, I haven't tried them. But the point is, if we put one in the officer's breathalyzer, if we put one in the officer's radio, if we put it in his cell phone, or if we actually issue him a cell phone with a specific IMEI, or issue her with a cell phone with specific numbers on it, then we can verify that that digital camera, that smartphone, that laptop, that breathalyzer was issued to that officer. And that officer is going to have some explaining to do if they can't explain why evidence was put onto that device that didn't come from them or one of their cases. Just like they'd have to explain why they left their gun in the bathroom, if they ever left their gun in the bathroom. So that's what we envision. Permission blockchain for law enforcement, where they hash and book the evidence, the blockchain records the hash immediately, and all the changes are immediately and forever evident. Because why not, right? Why not? So where are we now? I just finished the Sacramento Entrepreneurship Academy. It's called C. It's an excellent program. There were 10 fantastic teams, but I won Best in Show, and I'm proud of that. Happy to have that happen. And we did a booth, and there's some of my fancy marketing materials that I was telling you the folks from Consult Your Community made for us. So I was happy about that. I've presented this to 5 conferences so far. You guys are number 6. Next, I'm headed to the ISC Squared Security Congress. Those of you who are in information security will recognize them from the CISSP certificate. So they have a conference going on they call the Security Congress in Orlando in October. I'll be presenting this here a little longer, about an hour long. And then after that, I'm off to NIST and the National Institutes of Justice to talk about evidence management, because that's what we're doing. And getting NIST involved in helping us create a standard for law enforcement to use nationwide, maybe even worldwide, that's the group to go with. So what do we need? Well, we're looking for funding for development of a proof of concept or a partner to develop it with us. Anybody know any good coders, specifically in the blockchain area? Let me know. Yeah, I need coders. A partner to help open doors for us. Preferably somebody who knows a police chief who wouldn't mind, throwing some cutting-edge technology into their agency and helping us get this going. And assistance with scaling and expansion or support as we grow. So we could be funded for equity, we could partner for equity. All the usual startup routines are open and available, and we're ready to go.